We're live here in the mighty Blaze. Hi, everyone. My name is Kimberly Hensle Lowrance. I'm the co-host of Authors of Bookstores, a show that used to broadcast on the mighty Blaze, currently on hiatus. And I'm here today, out of retirement, if you will, to have a special conversation with my friend and the Blaze's podcast director, Trisha and Blanchet. We're going to talk about her brand new book, which is out today, HERRICK'S KEY. And I'm just double checking that we're live. And there we are. Perfect. Okay. We're all live. I see us. We're on Facebook. We're on YouTube. I hope you're tuning in today across platforms and joining us because we're very excited for Trisha. So let me tell you a little bit about Trisha. So Trisha, who writes as T.M. Blanchet, sounds very official, is the author of the Neath trilogy, which it started with HERRICK'S End. HERRICK'S Lie was the second book, and now the third book in the trilogy is out today, HERRICK'S KEY. It's published by Tiny Fox Press. Trisha is a former reporter, magazine editor, and she's an award-winning humor columnist. She founded the nonprofit organization Operation Delta Dog, service dogs for veterans. She's a proud member of the Tall Poppy Writers Association, the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association in Grub Street in Boston. She lives with her family in Massachusetts. Trisha, welcome.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for doing this, Kimberly. It's a real treat.
Of course. I'm delighted to be in conversation with you. I was up late last night, scrambling excitedly to the last pages of HERRICK'S KEY, to this conclusion of this trilogy you put together that I know I've been working on for many years. So I was so excited to spend time in that story. And we're going to be talking about these books and your writing journey. And to our audience, we'd love to get your questions. If you would like to ask Trisha anything about writing, about dogs, about
always dogs. Yes.
Always dogs. Just put them in the comments below the broadcast, and our fabulous behind the scenes producer Chuck will flag them for us. Okay, so congratulations on HERRICK'S KEY. As I mentioned, or as I showed everyone, this is the third and final book in the Neath trilogy, and this is a trilogy that's gotten a lot of wonderful feedback from readers and from the publishing world in general. Let's see some of the great things we have heard about this. Edwin Hill, who's a fan of the Blaze and a friend of the Blaze, wrote, "Be prepared for high stakes, a uniquely crafted world, and a view into history that will have you questioning everything you thought you knew." Hi, Robin. Thanks for being here. Jen Phillips, another friend of the Blaze, and we've had her on before, described your books as fans of Neil Gaiman will love the Neath. Julie Glurstenblatt, another friend of the Blaze and a former show host, called this a series, and particularly HERRICK'S KEY, a quest worth devouring. Kirkus said that this is a thoughtful and empowering hero's journey. So much fun to read these books. Congratulations on writing a trilogy. Tell us about this story and how you came to write it.
I was reading a book called The Witches by Stacy Schiff. It's a non-fiction book, and it's a true history of everything that happened in the Salem witch trials, even the tiny, weird, strange things you'd never normally hear about.
Yeah.
And she had a little thing at the beginning that was like a cast of characters, because there's so many people mentioned, it was hard to keep track. And one of the people mentioned in this very long list was a man named George Herrick. And all he got was one line, and it described him as handsome. And it said he used to be an upholsterer, but he spent the year of the witch trials as the deputy sheriff, carting off all the witches.
Huh.
So I don't know, it just intrigued me, like, handsome? Like, how do we know he's handsome? How did he go from being an upholsterer to, dragging off all these innocent people? And I did a little more research, and it turns out he was a pretty nasty fellow. And he loved his job, and he was on a real power trip, and he made it a lot more difficult for people than it had to be. And it just really got my brain going about this man. And at the end, when it was all over and all these people were dead and many, many more had lost everything, he brought a petition to the court, and he demanded overtime pay. because he basically thought he was the one who had been wronged the most during the witch trials. And he wanted overtime. So I just couldn't stop thinking about this crazy guy and his crazy request. And it got me thinking about revenge and the notion of revenge. And what if there really were witches back then, if just using my imagination? And what if they were able to get some kind of revenge? What would that be? What would it look like? So I kind of mulled that for a while. And then I had another story going in my head about a young guy in Boston who was really worried about a missing friend. So in my head, I just merged those two story ideas together. And this poor kid who went searching for his missing friend, really sweet young guy, gets sucked into a dangerous, magical world below the city of Boston that is all mixed up with those witches and that revenge and the alternate history of the Salem witch trials.
I love that these different threads, you know, this like random mention of this person in a book got your mind turning. And then you had this other thread about this young man and that you wove them together in a story. I love that sort of, it's always fascinating to hear where stories originate with writers. Right. And oftentimes they are something like that, like some like small detail that you just ask, well, who was this or why or what? And you're just curious, right? Like that curiosity.
Right. It's the what if.
A whole idea. Yeah. Like, honestly, Trisha, I didn't know George Herrick was a real person. I thought you had made him up. Yeah, and that he's a real person, like, adds this other dimension to it. It's really fascinating. Oh, yeah. And Liz, thanks, Liz, for your comment and for being here. Totally agree with you. This is an excellent trilogy to give to the YA fantasy reader in your life. I know my nephews are getting these books. Make a perfect gift set. Mother's Day, Father's Day. You don't have to be a young adult to read these books. Look at that. Perfect. Wouldn't that be a nice gift wrapped around with a ribbon? Hi, Mark. Thanks for Thoughtful Pro himself. Thanks for tuning in. Yeah, I'm such a fan of the Neath trilogy. We all are. Do you remember the first scene that you wrote in the trilogy, Trisha?
I do, yes.
What was it?
Because it was the scene that I couldn't get out of my brain, which was this young guy, and he was in a support group meeting of some kind. And he was supposed to be paying attention to his support group, but he couldn't because he was so worried about his missing friend. And the support group turned into a Weight Watchers type of support group. And I just wrote that scene and then just went from there because that was the one that I couldn't get out of my brain, basically.
So I'm a self-described greedy reader. Mm-hmm. So that means that I love myself a trilogy. I love myself a series. I love when I get to stay with the character for more than one book. It's my favorite because, you know, you fall in love with the character, you do not want to give up on them. Right. And so I'm so curious though about the process of writing more than one book in a story and the sort of the mechanics of it as a writer, like how you do that. Because you have obviously like the story that happens in the one book and then the story that maybe happens in two books, the story that happens in three, the overall themes, the individual themes. Can you talk a little bit about mechanics of writing a trilogy?
Yes. So it's interesting because book one it was originally written as a standalone.
Book one.
And then when the publisher got interested, they said, oh, but we really like trilogies. So can this be a trilogy? And I said, sure. So then I had to really think about, luckily there were a lot of questions that were still sort of hanging out there. So there was still like a lot of things you could touch upon and answer. I would say that the second was probably the trickiest because you have to sum up what happened in the first without boring people.
Right.
And then you have to start a completely new freestanding story because I have to assume someone might pick up book 2 or 3, never having read the others.
Right.
So you have to sum up enough information, but it has to be a good story just all by itself as well. And then when I got to book 3, it was like, oh my gosh, I really have to, all these loose ends have to come together in some meaningful way. And as Mark Cecil would say, who is watching the show today, who is my plot coach, you know, he would say, what are you trying to say? Like, what do you want people to come away from this book thinking about. So that's what I had to really get into in book 3. Like, all right, this is fun. This is exciting. This is an adventure video game. But really, what are we trying to say here? So that's what happened in book 3.
I love that piece of coaching advice from Mark. I usually phrase it for guests as, what's the question you're trying to answer with your story?
Yeah.
Which I think is the same thing. Like, what's the beating heart for you of this tale? And what do you think is the question? What are you trying to say with this particular series?
Well, when it started, as I say, I was really interested in the question of revenge.
Right.
Like, revenge gets a bad rap. Maybe revenge isn't so bad. What's wrong with a little revenge? Especially when you were really, really wronged, as a lot of us have been. But then as the story evolved into books 2 and 3, Ollie had to really think about that, because he saw revenge and he saw what it looks like. And it's pretty awful. And so he had to decide for himself, revenge or forgiveness. Like, which is the right answer here for him? So that's what he went through, all these turmoils, and people wronged him and people wronged people he loved, and on and on and on. And just in general, the history of the witch trials. So that was the big question he had to really think about.
Excellent. I should also say, hi, Renee. We put you up on the screen before. We get to say hello to you. Thanks for tuning in from Southeast Florida. What is it about? Hello, Margaret. Yes, much champagne today in celebration of HERRICK'S KEY coming out. What is the draw for you to write YA, and then specifically to write YA fantasy? What attracted you to this genre?
I didn't really set out to write YA. It was just, that was the age of the character. So that's where the bookstores shelve it, because he's 19 years old. But I love fantasy for any age, just because what I always seem to write is our world. It looks like our world, but there's a secret undertone to it that only certain people know about, or certain people can see. Just the secretive nature of that fascinates me. Those are the kinds of stories I gravitate toward. And I do like to write about our modern day world, as opposed to historical or a completely made up world or something like that. So the fantasy, the portal fantasy, it just sort of sat right in the YA fantasy line there.
It's interesting. I think I've heard that in other interviews I've done for the Blaze, authors who write a story and they're driven by the story and by the characters, and they don't think about genre, right? Mm-hmm. That the genre is a product of marketing, or maybe something that the agent or the editor or the bookseller decides, that really the author's job is in service to the story, whatever the story is.
Right. I kind of cringe when it's described as YA, which means young adult, because I feel like it really is for adults too. It's just an interesting story. Just the main character happens to be 19. But it's something we all think about, we all can relate to, as being wronged, and revenge, forgiveness, all those kinds of questions.
What's your favorite fantasy series? You said you liked fantasy, you're attracted to it. Do you have a go-to fantasy series that you read?
I love The Magicians, that whole series. A similar age group, they're like college age.
Yep. That's Lev Grossman, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm. I love all the Anne Rice books, the vampire books. I love zombie books, apocalypse books, you name it. Any type of portal, weirdness, witches, magic.
Yeah. You lost me at zombies. One of the things you do really well in these books is incorporate Boston as a character. I mean, so we should just tell our audience rather, that Boston, the book sort of starts in Boston, but goes to a place called the Neath, which is underneath Boston and is a magical world. And yet the main character, Ollie, does spend time back up in Boston, or what they call Brickside. I'm trying to be careful and not give any spoilers. And you make Boston a character in these books, in the sense that you send Ollie to places that, as a Boston resident or Boston lover for many, many, many years, I now think twice about. I mean, the other day I was walking through the Boston Public Garden. I was like, oh, over there is where Ollie goes into the Neath. Like, it just made me think about the place I know well very differently. And there's historic sites that you incorporate as well. Talk a little bit about that decision to ground the story in Boston, to incorporate history. How did you decide to do that? What was your process to incorporate historical elements into the story?
Well, as I mentioned, Ollie has some struggles with his weight and with food, and that's one of his central struggles. And he attends Weight Watchers type meetings, and it's just kind of the bane of his existence. And I was trying to think of where could you situate someone who has that struggle that would make that struggle the worst it could possibly be. And the first place that jumped into my mind is the North End in Boston, which is, the Little Italy. I actually counted, there are, I think, more than 90 bakeries, restaurants, cafes, coffee shops. It's just food, and it's all delicious. So I just thought I'd put him there to give him the hardest possible time. Sorry, Ollie. And then once that was decided, I wanted to make everything as real as possible. So I wanted there to be lots of locations that you could actually go to on your own 2 feet. Like, there's a street, there's buildings, there's all kinds of things. And then, of course, the portal that he falls through is the Freedom Trail. Right. So locals and tourists alike will know what the Freedom Trail is. It's a line of bricks that takes you around to all the famous historic sites in the city.
Yep.
And each time you get to a site, there is a metal medallion in the ground, and it's round, and you probably never noticed it before. You probably stepped on it and walked right over it. But that is the portal into the underground world, right on the Freedom Trail.
And you balance this historical place. Thanks, Edwin, for being here. Ellen, so many other people are logging in and to watch today. Thank you, and we appreciate your support. So you balance these real places in Boston with your own historical twist, right?
Yes.
And magic, because that's a huge part of this story is magic and hi, Margaret, and mythical creatures. I'm not even going to list all of the creatures that exist in the Neath because I'm bound to miss a whole bunch. But there are these like really wonderful, inventive characters. And there's this balance between the two of them, like the real and the fantastical. How do you strike that balance? I think it's a question for any fantasy writer, because you need to ground us in something we identify with, but you also need to sweep us away with something that's creative and different. How do you walk that line?
I wanted each place to be recognizable, but a little bit off. So in the book, you're like, well, it sort of looks like that, but there's something different. There's something strange. Like there's a beautiful carousel on the Rose Kennedy Greenway, sorry. It's an animal carousel. It is magical in real life. It's like, instead of horses, it's all kinds of like a giant grasshopper and crazy animal. I mean, things like that are magical anyway. So trying to put a magical spin on it really isn't that hard. I just sort of made them come to life and had them talk to Ollie. So the city of Boston to me is pretty magical to begin with. If you kind of go slow and look at each thing closely, you can let your imagination run wild. That's for sure.
I think these books are so good if you're coming on vacation to Boston. Like, right? Because you could imagine someone doing a walking tour of Boston following the books.
Yeah, you could.
Because, right? You can Boston Common, the Greenway, the Aquarium, Bunker Hill, the North End. I mean, I'm just thinking that's a companion piece you have to write, Trisha.
Oh, that'd be good.
Boston through Ollie's eyes, right?
And then in book 3, he ends up in Salem, of course. We have to get back to Salem. So that's a whole thing as well.
Salem. Yep. So once you and I recently had a conversation about writing, and you said this thing that I keep thinking about, which is, I'm going to paraphrase you because you obviously said it a lot better, but you said that for you, the writing process has to be play, that you have to sit down to write and feel excited by the story and feel like essentially that you're playing. Yeah. And I like really keep thinking about that. especially when I was reading Herrick's Key, because I felt like there is such playfulness and joy in your writing. It feels to me like you are having so much fun creating these stories.
Definitely. I know a lot of my fellow writers do the whole, you need to do a certain page count every day, or you need to do a certain word count every day. And you have to have spreadsheets, and you have to, and I've tried that because I feel like, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do. So I'll do it that way. But the minute I do that, it sucks all of the enjoyment out of it for me. And it just feels like work. And to write a really adventurous, fun type of story, I think you have to be having a lot of fun while you're doing it. And honestly, if I've sat there for an hour, if I'm not having a great time, I put it away. And I just say, okay, I guess it'll be tomorrow. I'm just not feeling it today. Or I'll go for a walk and try to get into it. But I really do think it comes across on the page. And it's not necessarily even fun. Like if you're writing about something, heartfelt, and you're not feeling it, that'll come across as well. So I just feel that's just the way I have to do it to keep myself motivated. I don't look at page count or word count ever.
Okay. So we're getting some audience questions, and Edwin asks, I hear you, Edwin. How do you find that playfulness? Like you just said, if I don't have it, I walk away. But that could go on for weeks at a time where you're not finding the play. Like what do you do in your life to encourage that joy in your writing? Is there something, I guess I'm asking how you feed your soul.
Yeah, I do a lot of what ifs. If I'm stuck or if I'm not having fun, I just come up with a crazy what if. Like the problem is, how do I get him from point A to point B? I could have him walk there. And I write that scene and I'm like, well, that's a little boring. He walked there. Okay. What if, there was a crazy lava pit that he had to somehow get across, and how is he going to do that? And all these insane things that I probably will not end up using in the end, but it's enough to get my brain going where I'm like, okay, at least it's something much more interesting than he walked there. It's maybe not a lava pit, but it was a lot more fun. And I usually just do those silly little exercises just to get back into it.
It makes me think of improv. When people do improv, they always have to say yes, and yes, they just embrace the silly. So it sounds like you're embracing these wild ideas because they'll just shake loose whatever cobwebs.
And when in doubt, just walk the dog. That's usually...
When in doubt, walk the dog. Best advice ever.
That usually works for me.
That works for everything, actually.
I know, exactly.
Renee asks a vital question. Are there zombies, witches, or ghosts in this book? Renee, I'm with you on the zombies. That's a trigger warning I always need. I can assure you that there are no zombies in this book.
No ghosts either. Just witches.
But just witches. Excellent. Okay. So
but the witches look a lot like you and me.
Witches look, dragons? Not dragons.
No dragons.
No dragons. That's a trend in YA and in fantasy in general. But no dragons in this book. Worm walkers. Trogs.
There are lots of worm walkers, yeah.
Trogs.
And trogs.
What is Mrs. Paget? Crow.
Giant crow.
Giant crow. Many other interesting and inventive characters, but thankfully no zombies. So one question that I have when I read books, I think about the shape of the story. I know not everyone likes this question, but I'm always curious about the shape a story takes. And sometimes the shape is really clear to me as I read, and sometimes it's hard. And I thought that these books, this trilogy you wrote, that you very much written a hero's journey, right? And that's not quite a shape. But I'm wondering if you visualize this story that Ollie is on, is there some sort of visual representation of the Neath and Herrick's End and Herrick's Lie, Herrick's Key, like something that makes you think, oh yes, that's the story I'm telling? Or is this question too not relevant to your book?
Well, usually what I do, I sort of equate it to traveling on a trip, on a vacation. So when I leave, I always have my ticket. I know when I'm leaving and I know when I'm getting back. I know which hotels I'm staying in along the way and which cities I'm staying in. and maybe like the major tourist attractions in each location. But for the most part, other than that broad, I'm going on a trip and those are the places I'm going. I leave the rest sort of just open to whatever I'm feeling that day. And sometimes that's great and it turns out great. And sometimes I'm like, oh, whatever I did yesterday was awful. Let's erase that and do something different. But I try not to be too rigid. I try not to see the shape of the story ahead of time too much, because again, that makes it a little boring for me. It doesn't keep me on my toes as much. I like sort of not knowing. Like I have to get him from point A to point B when I wake up tomorrow morning. I don't know how I'm going to do that. And I find that very interesting to just know I have to wake up and figure that out.
But do you know what the ending is? Like, did you know how the trilogy would end?
I knew roughly. Often I know, and then it completely changes anyway, because I think of something better as I go along. But I do have something in mind before I start.
Okay.
That's about the best I can do there. And it almost always changes, or in a major or minor way.
Were you someone who played a lot of games, like board games growing up?
No, not really.
Because it feels like this book, there's so many twists and turns and clues, right? Like,
well, I'm a video gamer.
You're a video gamer. Okay, so you are, like, games are something that you're familiar with.
Yeah, so a lot of this, especially books 1 and 2, are really inspired by the type of video games I like to play, which is a lot of puzzle solving, adventure, bad guys hiding around the corner. How am I going to get around them? That sort of adventurous feel. Yeah.
Yes, I can totally see that in your books, because there definitely feels like, here's a clue, and then this is going to happen, and then we're going to go here, and then I have to figure out what this means. Like a lot of that, where your brain is really engaged in the story. Yeah. Beforehand. Okay. Oh, Ellen's asking, did you always know that Ollie's story had to be a trilogy? So we talked a little bit about this, right? That originally it was a standalone book and then you expanded it to a trilogy.
And I'm so glad, because I didn't realize how much more there was to tell till I was sort of forced to do it. So I'm really glad it turned out that way.
Can we talk a little bit about Ollie? So Ollie Delgado is your main character, and he is is it fair to say he's a reluctant hero?
Oh, yeah.
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 And he's a little bit a loner in the beginning, a little sad, but he has a crush on a girl, and she disappears. And that, for those people who haven't yet read the first book, and that her disappearance is what drives his journey into the Neath. Yeah. And then things change dramatically from there. And he really develops a very different reasons for being in the Neath, and he creates a whole community for himself there with many, many friends, and all of those friends come back in HERRICK'S KEY. They all have a role. Yep. And I wondered about that process of being with a character for 3 books. How do you ensure the character arc? How did you approach showing the reader that the Ollie Delgado they meet in the first page of HERRICK'S End is a different Ollie Delgado that we see on the last page of HERRICK'S KEY? Talk a little bit about character growth and arcs.
I think I just kept getting to know him better and better. And at first I thought his main issues, so to speak, were his weight issues and eating issues, and his, I don't know, similar things like that. And that he didn't really know what he wanted to do with his life. You know, typical things a 19-year-old might struggle with. But the more I went along, I realized it was really his loneliness. Like that's really was his central issue. The eating and the weight was just like a side effect of all that. He just wanted a place to belong. He wanted people to belong to. He wanted his tribe, and he wasn't finding it up on the Brickside. And was shocked to find it down in this very strange, some might say awful place, that to find your happy ending, so to speak, in a place like that instead of back at home. So I just found that sort of fascinating. And then it's at one point, I don't want to spoil anything, but he does get the opportunity to come back to our world, to come home. And then he's, has to face a decision about, do I stay here? I'm back. I wanted to come back. Here I am. Or do I go back to that world? So that was also another dilemma. So I thought a lot about what does he really, really want? And that's what he really wanted in the end. And it was sort of like he told me what he really wanted as we went along.
Which of the characters in the series were your favorite to write?
Laszlo. Laszlo is a Ukrainian acrobat who is just kind of the comic relief. And his grasp of English is perhaps not fabulous. So that causes lots of comic relief throughout as he tries to talk to people and explain things and the way they react to him. And he's just a real funny, lovable character. So he was probably one of my favorites.
I loved him too. I could see him. I think your book is very visual, and I don't know if that's just because it's so fantastic. It's so fantastical, right? There are these creatures that clearly don't exist in real life, and so you really have to concentrate on imagining them, and then they become so real in your mind.
Yes, you really do have to think about it sometimes. Like the crow boats. Mm-hmm. So up here we have the swan boats, but down below they have the crow boats, and it's a whole different situation. So trying to visualize things like that is fun for me. Like, all right, what would that actually look like?
And Liz chimes in to say that she, having gone to school and then work near the public garden and now living in the town next to Salem, this series is going to be a walk through places I know. Love it.
Awesome.
It's true, Liz. You will think of things differently now. You will walk by the swan boats in Boston and wonder why aren't they crow boats. So there's this, we talked about earlier, there's this big theme in the books about revenge. And that really morphs, isn't it, to the flip side of that, forgiveness. And that seems to be a big theme in this last book, especially.
Yeah.
How do you forgive people who have wronged you? And what does forgiveness offer you and the person who wronged you? Can you talk a little bit about the shift from seeking revenge to offering forgiveness?
Yeah, I read a quote somewhere about, I wish I could remember who, because I'm sure you all know who said the quote, but it was something about forgiveness isn't for you. It isn't for the other person. It's for you. So in other words, when you hold on to the anger, it sickens you. It doesn't do anything to the other person. So you may as well just forgive them, and it's healthier for your own growth and life. Yeah. So I started thinking a lot about that because it was so profound to me. And then I started thinking, what would that physically look like? Like if magic were involved, what would that look like if forgiving someone helped you physically? So that's kind of like, I started to think about that in terms of magic spells and witches and things like that. And what would the opposite look like physically? If you held on to that anger, what would it do to you in a magical world? So that's sort of where we were going with book 3. I don't want to give too much away, but.
Excellent. What do you hope readers take away from these books? So, somebody who gets to the end of HERRICK'S KEY, what's the feeling that you want them to have? What do you hope that they hold in their minds about these books? Like that they maybe tell someone else when they're handing them the book for a birthday present or a graduation present or Father's Day or Mother's Day or whatever the occasion. What do you hope they say about the books?
I think as you're reading, and a lot of people tell me this, as they're reading, particularly book 1, they're like, Ollie, for heaven's sake, believe in yourself. Right. You're smart, you're handsome, you're funny, you're all these great, great things, and he cannot see it. And it's so frustrating as the reader, but we all do that, right? We all do that. Like every time we're talking to one of our friends, they're like, oh, I want to lose 10 pounds or I want to blah, 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 whatever it is. And your friends are like, are you crazy? Look at yourself. You're amazing. So we're all Ollie. That's sort of what I was just trying to get across. Like, yeah, he happens to be a boy. He happens to be this age. He happens to be whatever he is, but it's all of us and we just can't see it. So that's sort of like what I wanted to say with all these, that it's just, you can be anything. You can do anything. Just do it. You can do it.
Excellent. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Chuck. This is the next thing I was going to put up on the screen. Okay. Ellen asks, okay, we've gotten to the end of the Neath trilogy. Where does Ollie go next? And what's next for you writing-wise?
Well, I may or may not be working on something new that I'm very excited about. Takes place in a place called Mill City. So it is not Boston this time, but it's not too far from my house. It may just be a place that looks an awful lot like Lowell, Massachusetts, AKA Mill City. Yeah. And I think it's probably going to be an adult character this time. And it might be a whodunit. We'll see. It might be a little bit different.
What's the different approach, or is there a different approach when you're writing a YA novel versus writing for adults? Do you feel like something about your process is different?
Yes, definitely. So when you know you're writing YA, you have to be very, very conscious of language. There's no sex, drugs, and rock and roll for the most part, because librarians and teachers and people have to approve this book, and they don't want to see a lot of that. So with an adult book, you can put all that in and not worry too much about it. You don't have to guard yourself or your language, and your character can do kind of just genuinely bad things, as characters sometimes do, and you don't have to worry as much about it. So it's a little more freeing, I think.
Interesting. You have a launch event coming up. So today is the day your book comes out, but you have a launch event. Can you tell our audience a little bit about that?
Yes, it is Saturday, May 4th at 2 p.m. at La La Books in Lowell, downtown Lowell. And it is part of their halfway to Halloween party event. So yes, I will be wearing some ridiculous Halloween-y clothes. Feel free to do the same if you want to join us. There'll be actually other things going on that day as well. I think they're going to have like food and games and activities for all ages. And I'm in there probably from 2 to 3-ish is when I'll be slotted in there. It should be a lot of fun.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't use this platform today to ask for a shout out from you to any like local indie bookstores, or not local, but any indie bookstores that have been meaningful to you in spreading the word about the Neath. Is there anyone you want to give a shout to?
Yes, Belmont Books, which I know is one of your fave places as well. They've been so great to me. And Silver Unicorn Books in Acton. And of course, Lala Books in Lowell, which is the closest to where I live.
Okay. So those are all indie bookstores that are here in Massachusetts, where you can hop on their websites if you're not in person and pick up a copy of HERRICK'S KEY, HERRICK'S Lie, HERRICK'S Lie, HERRICK'S End. I love these covers, by the way, Trisha.
Thanks. Can't take any credit for that, but I love them too.
I think they're so good. I like. They're really great. I love
how they complement each other with the colors exactly. And stuff.
They really feel like a family. I love when, again, greedy reader here who always wants a series, and I love when the books like go together. It makes me feel like it was intentional and well thought out. What are you reading now? What's on your bedside table to give people?
I just finished RuPaul's memoir. That was great. Right now I'm reading The Map Thief, which is another nonfiction, and a bunch of whodunits, because I'm trying to get deep into the whodunit world. Good Girl's Guide to Murder I'm reading, and a couple others like that.
Excellent. Congratulations again.
Thank you.
On HERRICK'S End and this wonderful series you've created. Thanks to our audience for tuning in today and helping us celebrate Trisha's launch.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
And please go to your local indie bookstore and pick up a copy of all of the Neath series. It is a great gift this graduation, Father's Day, Mother's Day time. You can always pick up a copy and save it for the winter holidays as well. And, thank you for joining us here on A Mighty Blaze. If you like today's special interview, we have many others. And you can subscribe to A Mighty Blaze on Facebook to get notified about all of our other events, or hop over to our website, amightyblaze.com, to sign up for the newsletter. And we hope you'll join us next time. We have so many wonderful authors always on the Blaze. And also I should have a shout out today to one of our Blaze co-founders, Caroline Levitt. Her new book, Days of Wonder, is out today as well. And we encourage you to check that out. She's on the show. She's on the Blaze next week, right? With Mark.
I think so, yeah.
On the Thoughtful Bro. So definitely something you want to make sure you don't miss. Okay. Thanks, Trisha. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
and of course, thanks
everybody.
to Chuck behind the scenes for making
Jack.
everything run so smoothly. Bye, everyone.